It is in this moment that the conversation about wealth becomes far more interesting than most people realize. Because what we often call financial success is rarely just about numbers. It is about energy, perception, emotion, and the invisible patterns we carry within us every day. When I look at the emerging science of consciousness alongside ancient observations of human behavior, I find a fascinating connection. The people who consistently create abundance often share something deeper than intelligence, education, or even opportunity. They share a particular internal state. Their bodies, minds, and emotions are moving in the same direction. Most individuals try to attract money by focusing only on external actions. They work harder, they learn new skills, they create plans and strategies. These things matter. But there is another layer beneath all of them. That layer is frequency. Now, when I use the word frequency, I am not speaking about magic or wishful thinking. I am referring to the measurable patterns that exist throughout nature. Every electrical signal in the brain operates through frequencies. The heart generates electromagnetic fields. The nervous system communicates through electrical impulses. Our biology is constantly expressing patterns. What becomes truly interesting is how our emotional states influence those patterns. Think about a moment when you felt trapped by fear. Your breathing became shallow. Your muscles tightened. Your attention narrowed. Your mind searched for threats. Your body was preparing for survival. Now compare that with a moment when you felt confident, inspired, or deeply grateful. Your posture changed. Your breathing expanded. Your creativity increased. Solutions appeared more easily. Opportunities seemed more visible. The external world may not have changed immediately, but your relationship with that world changed dramatically. This shift matters because our perception influences our choices, and our choices influence our outcomes. Many people unknowingly carry a frequency of scarcity. Scarcity is not merely a lack of money. Scarcity is a biological and psychological state. It is the feeling that there is never enough, not enough time, not enough opportunity, not enough resources, not enough success. When this pattern becomes deeply embedded, the body begins operating from chronic stress. And chronic stress has profound effects on decision-making. Research in neuroscience shows that prolonged stress reduces cognitive flexibility. In simple terms, the brain becomes less capable of seeing new possibilities. It becomes focused on immediate survival. This creates a powerful cycle. The person fears lack. The fear creates stress. The stress narrows perception. Narrow perception limits opportunity. Limited opportunity reinforces fear. And the cycle repeats itself. What many people interpret as bad luck may actually be the result of an unconscious pattern that has been running for years. This is why changing beliefs is not simply a mental exercise. Beliefs are embodied experiences. A belief is not just something I think. A belief is something my nervous system has accepted as true. If someone grows up hearing that wealth is difficult, rare, or reserved for other people, those ideas often become deeply rooted emotional programs. Even when the conscious mind desires abundance, the subconscious pattern may still be broadcasting limitation. The body and mind begin sending conflicting signals. One part wants expansion. Another part expects disappointment. And whenever these signals conflict, progress becomes difficult. This is where emotional coherence becomes important. Emotional coherence occurs when thoughts, feelings, and physiological responses begin working together instead of against one another. Imagine trying to drive a vehicle while pressing the accelerator and the brake at the same time. The engine strains. Movement becomes inefficient. Energy is wasted. Many people approach wealth in exactly this way. They say they want prosperity, yet internally they fear success. They fear responsibility. They fear judgment. They fear failure. Their conscious intention moves forward, while their emotional conditioning pulls backward. The result is resistance. Ancient traditions often describe this process using different language, but the principle remains remarkably similar. They understood that inner harmony precedes outer effectiveness. Modern science increasingly reveals why. Every thought creates a biochemical response. Every emotion influences physiology. Every repeated emotional state reinforces neural pathways. Over time, these pathways become familiar programs. And what is familiar often feels safe, even when it no longer serves us. This is why shifting frequency requires more than positive thinking. Positive thinking alone often fails because it attempts to replace deeply rooted emotional patterns with surface-level affirmations. The subconscious mind responds more strongly to experience than to words. If I repeatedly say, "I am wealthy," while feeling anxiety, self-doubt, and fear, the emotional signal usually carries greater influence than the statement itself. The body believes what it experiences. This is why emotional rehearsal can be so powerful. Elite athletes have used forms of mental rehearsal for decades. They imagine successful performance in vivid detail. Their brains begin creating neural patterns similar to those activated during real experience. The body starts preparing for a future event before it physically occurs. Now imagine applying the same principle to abundance. Instead of obsessing over financial problems, I begin cultivating the emotional experience associated with stability, confidence, creativity, and opportunity. Not pretending, not denying reality, but training the nervous system to become familiar with a new possibility. At first, the shift may feel subtle. A different thought appears. A new idea emerges. A conversation leads somewhere unexpected. An opportunity that was previously invisible suddenly enters awareness. The outer changes often begin as inner changes, and that is where many people miss the deeper secret. They expect wealth to create confidence, but very often confidence creates the conditions that allow wealth to emerge. Because when the body is no longer trapped in survival mode, energy becomes available for innovation, connection, creativity, and strategic thinking. The frequency begins to change. Perception begins to expand. New patterns begin forming within the brain and nervous system. And as these patterns strengthen over time, something remarkable starts to happen. The person who once identified with limitation gradually starts seeing themselves differently, and that new identity becomes the foundation from which every future decision is made. Because once the nervous system accepts a new reality as familiar, the boundaries that once seemed permanent begin to dissolve in ways that can feel almost invisible at first. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal transformation. Most people are searching for a dramatic moment, a single breakthrough that changes everything overnight. Yet when I examine both human behavior and the science of adaptation, I see something different. Real change often begins quietly. A new belief forms. A new emotional response emerges. A new interpretation replaces an old one. These shifts may appear insignificant, but they are the seeds from which entirely new realities grow. Consider how the brain learns. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. The more frequently a thought, emotion, or behavior is repeated, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, what was once difficult starts feeling natural. The same principle applies to wealth consciousness. If scarcity has been practiced for years, abundance may initially feel unfamiliar, and the human nervous system tends to resist what feels unfamiliar, even when that unfamiliar experience could improve life. This creates an important paradox. Many people desire greater financial freedom, yet emotionally they remain attached to the identity they have always known. The identity feels predictable. Predictability feels safe. Safety feels comfortable. As a result, opportunities for growth can trigger discomfort rather than excitement. This is why frequency is deeply connected to identity. Every identity carries expectations. Every expectation influences behavior. And behavior ultimately shapes outcomes. A person who identifies as someone who struggles financially often notices evidence that confirms that identity. They become highly aware of obstacles, limitations, and setbacks. Meanwhile, someone who identifies as a creator of value tends to focus on solutions, possibilities, and long-term opportunities. Both individuals may live in the same environment. Both may face similar challenges. Yet their internal filters produce dramatically different experiences. The brain is constantly selecting information from an overwhelming amount of sensory input. We simply cannot process everything at once, so the mind prioritizes what appears most relevant. What determines relevance? To a surprising degree, our beliefs do. If I believe opportunity is scarce, my attention naturally searches for proof. If I believe opportunity exists, my attention begins searching for openings. This does not guarantee immediate success, but it dramatically changes the probability of recognizing possibilities when they appear. In many ways, frequency acts like a filter. It influences what I notice. It influences how I interpret events. It influences how I respond to challenges. And over time, these responses accumulate into results. This is why emotional mastery is not merely a personal development concept. It is a practical skill. Think about the difference between reacting and responding. When someone operates from chronic stress, reactions tend to be automatic. Fear drives decisions. Impatience overrides wisdom. Short-term relief becomes more important than long-term growth. But when emotional regulation improves, space emerges between stimulus and response. Within that space lies choice. And choice is one of the most valuable resources a human being possesses. The ability to pause, the ability to evaluate, the ability to act intentionally rather than impulsively. These capacities often determine whether opportunities are expanded or lost. I find it fascinating that many of the world's most successful individuals emphasize internal disciplines as much as external strategies. They cultivate focus. They cultivate emotional resilience. They cultivate clarity. These qualities are not separate from success. They are foundational to it. The reason is simple. Money itself amplifies existing patterns. If someone lacks emotional stability, greater resources often magnify instability. If someone possesses clarity and purpose, greater resources often magnify effectiveness. The external world tends to reflect and amplify internal organization. This is why developing wealth consciousness is not fundamentally about acquiring money. It is about becoming the kind of person who can create, manage, and expand value consistently. Value is the true currency beneath every financial system. People are rewarded when they solve problems, when they create useful products, when they provide meaningful services, when they improve the lives of others. The greater the value created, the greater the potential flow of resources. This shifts the entire conversation. Instead of asking, how do I get more money, a more powerful question becomes, how can I become a greater source of value? Notice how different those questions feel. One emerges from scarcity. The other emerges from contribution. One focuses on taking. The other focuses on creating. And creation carries a very different frequency. When the mind becomes oriented toward contribution, new possibilities begin appearing. Creativity expands, curiosity increases, connections deepen. The individual stops seeing wealth as something to chase and begins seeing it as something that can emerge naturally through aligned action. This alignment is essential. Frequency alone without action produces little change. Action without alignment often produces exhaustion. But when inner state and outer behavior begin moving together, momentum develops. Momentum is powerful because it builds evidence. A small success creates confidence. Confidence encourages action. Action generates experience. Experience reinforces belief. And belief strengthens identity. A new cycle begins forming. Unlike the old cycle of scarcity, this cycle feeds expansion. This is why I encourage people to pay close attention to their daily emotional environment. Not just major events, not just life-changing moments, but ordinary experiences. The conversations they have, the media they consume, the thoughts they repeat, the emotions they rehearse. Each of these elements contributes to the overall frequency being reinforced within the nervous system. Every day becomes a form of training. The question is whether that training is strengthening limitation or possibility. Most people underestimate the cumulative power of small emotional habits. Yet the nervous system does not distinguish between a massive shift repeated repeated once and a small shift repeated consistently, over time, repetition wins. This understanding changes how I view abundance entirely. Wealth is not simply a destination. It is an expression of patterns. Patterns of thought, patterns of emotion, patterns of behavior, patterns of identity. And when those patterns begin aligning with creativity, confidence, adaptability, and value creation, something remarkable starts unfolding. The individual no longer sees themselves as waiting for circumstances to improve. Instead, they begin recognizing that every choice, every emotional response, and every belief is contributing to a larger field of possibility that is shaping their future in real time. And once that realization becomes more than an idea, once it becomes a lived experience, the relationship between consciousness and abundance starts revealing an even deeper principle, one that challenges the way most people have been taught to think about success in the first place. Because success may not begin where most people have been conditioned to look. For generations, many individuals have been taught that external circumstances determine internal states. The assumption is simple: once I achieve enough, earn enough, own enough, or accomplish enough, then I will finally feel secure, confident, and fulfilled. Yet when we observe human experience carefully, we discover that reality often unfolds in the opposite direction. The internal state influences how external circumstances are interpreted, navigated, and ultimately transformed. This does not mean thoughts magically create money. It means consciousness influences behavior, behavior influences decisions, and decisions influence outcomes. The process is both practical and profound. Consider two people facing the exact same challenge. Both experience financial uncertainty. Both encounter unexpected setbacks. Both feel pressure, yet one becomes overwhelmed and withdraws. The other becomes curious and adaptive. One sees an ending. The other sees information. One focuses on what has been lost. The other focuses on what can be learned. The difference is not necessarily intelligence, it is state, the emotional and psychological state from which they engage reality. This is where frequency becomes especially important. Every emotional state carries a different quality of perception. Fear narrows awareness. Shame contracts possibility. Resentment consumes energy. Hopelessness reduces initiative. But gratitude, confidence, determination, and inspiration create entirely different biological conditions. These emotions influence hormones, attention, motivation, and resilience. The body begins supporting growth rather than merely defending against threat. I often think of this as the difference between survival consciousness and creative consciousness. Survival consciousness is concerned with immediate protection. Its purpose is valuable. Human beings need it. Without it, we could not navigate danger. The problem arises when survival becomes the default state long after the immediate threat has passed. Many people remain physiologically prepared for emergencies that no longer exist. Their bodies continue responding to imagined futures as though they are present realities. The nervous system remains vigilant. Energy remains constrained. Creativity remains suppressed. Over time, this state becomes normalized. People begin believing that chronic stress is simply part of life. Yet the body was never designed to thrive under continuous pressure. It was designed to move between periods of challenge and periods of restoration. And restoration is where some of the most important shifts occur. During moments of calm, the brain integrates information differently. Insight becomes more accessible. Learning improves. Problem solving expands. The mind becomes capable of seeing connections that stress previously concealed. This explains why breakthroughs often arrive during walks, moments of reflection, or periods of relaxation, rather than during frantic effort. When tension decreases, awareness expands. And awareness is one of the most valuable assets in the creation of abundance. Most opportunities do not arrive with announcements. They appear quietly, as an idea, a relationship, a conversation, a skill, a pattern that others overlook. The ability to recognize these opportunities depends heavily on mental and emotional clarity. This is why cultivating frequency is not about escaping reality. It is about becoming more capable of engaging reality effectively. The individual who develops emotional balance gains access to resources that were always present but previously unavailable. Patience becomes available. Discernment becomes available. Creativity becomes available. Strategic thinking becomes available. These qualities are often mistaken for luck by those observing from the outside. But what appears as luck frequently emerges from a state of readiness. A prepared mind recognizes possibilities that an overwhelmed mind cannot see. This leads to another important insight. Abundance is often less about attraction and more about alignment. When people hear the phrase attracting wealth, they sometimes imagine resources appearing without effort. Yet the deeper principle involves becoming aligned with the qualities that naturally generate value: clarity, consistency, discipline, adaptability, vision. These qualities create conditions where opportunity can be recognized and acted upon. In this sense, wealth becomes a byproduct of alignment rather than the primary objective. And this perspective changes everything. Instead of obsessing over outcomes, attention shifts toward becoming. Who am I becoming through my daily choices? What emotional patterns am I reinforcing? What beliefs am I strengthening? What habits am I practicing? Every answer influences frequency. Every frequency influences behavior. Every behavior contributes to future results. The process is ongoing. It is occurring whether we consciously participate or not. This is why self-awareness becomes such a powerful tool. Without awareness, old patterns continue operating automatically. With awareness, choice enters the equation. And once choice becomes available, transformation becomes possible. I can notice a limiting thought without accepting it as truth. I can observe fear without allowing it to dictate my actions. I can recognize old conditioning while consciously choosing a different response. Each moment of awareness interrupts the momentum of the past. Each conscious choice begins creating a different future. Over time, these moments accumulate. The nervous system learns, the identity evolves, the frequency changes. Eventually, what once required effort becomes natural. Confidence no longer feels forced. Abundance no longer feels distant. Opportunity no longer feels rare. The individual begins relating to life from an entirely different foundation. And perhaps this is the most important realization of all. The goal is not to become someone else. The goal is to remove the patterns that prevent our natural capacities from expressing themselves fully. Human beings possess extraordinary potential for adaptation. The brain can change, beliefs can change, behaviors can change, identities can change. Science continues revealing just how flexible human systems truly are. What once seemed fixed often proves surprisingly malleable. This means that no matter how long scarcity has been present, it does not have to remain permanent. No matter how deeply a limiting belief has been reinforced, it can be replaced. No matter how familiar stress has become, a different internal state can be cultivated. The process requires patience. It requires consistency. It requires willingness. But transformation becomes possible the moment awareness replaces autopilot. And once a person begins living from that awareness, they start noticing subtle shifts that would have been invisible before. Small changes in perception, energy, decision-making, and opportunity that seem unrelated at first, yet gradually reveal themselves as pieces of a much larger pattern. A pattern suggesting that consciousness may play a far more active role in shaping the trajectory of our lives than conventional thinking has ever fully acknowledged. And that understanding opens the door to an even deeper exploration of how human intention interacts with the hidden mechanisms of possibility. And this is where the discussion moves beyond habits, beliefs, and psychology into a question that has fascinated thinkers, scientists, and observers of human potential for generations. What exactly happens when intention becomes focused? Most people experience intention as a simple desire. They want something. They think about it. They hope it happens. But focused intention is something entirely different. Focused intention is desire combined with clarity, emotion, attention, and consistent action. It is the difference between casually wishing for change and becoming internally organized around a vision. When I observe people who create meaningful transformations in their lives, I notice a common pattern. Their energy is not scattered. Their attention is not divided among endless contradictions. They develop a clear relationship with what they are building. Their thoughts support it. Their emotions support it. Their behaviors support it. The entire system begins moving in the same direction. This alignment creates a powerful effect. Imagine sunlight falling across a field. The energy is present, but it is dispersed. Now imagine that same sunlight passing through a magnifying lens. Suddenly, the energy becomes concentrated. Its impact changes dramatically. Human attention works in a similar way. When attention is fragmented by fear, doubt, distraction, and conflicting priorities, enormous amounts of energy are lost. But when attention becomes focused, the quality of our actions changes. Decisions become clearer. Effort becomes more effective. Momentum increases. What many people call manifestation may often be the practical result of sustained alignment. The individual becomes so internally consistent that their actions begin producing outcomes that once seemed impossible. This perspective removes the need for magical explanations while preserving the profound nature of the process. The mind influences the body influences behavior. Behavior influences results. Results influence future beliefs. And the cycle continues. What becomes especially fascinating is how expectation influences performance. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. When individuals genuinely expect positive outcomes, their behavior often changes in subtle but important ways. They persist longer. They recover faster from setbacks. They remain open to alternatives. They engage opportunities with greater confidence. These behaviors dramatically improve the likelihood of success. Expectation becomes a force that shapes action. Action shapes reality. This is one reason limiting beliefs can be so costly. A limiting belief does more than create negative thoughts. It quietly influences countless decisions. It affects what opportunities we pursue. It affects what risks we take. It affects what possibilities we allow ourselves to imagine. Over time, these small influences accumulate into major differences in life outcomes. This is why transforming frequency often begins with transforming possibility. Before a new reality can emerge externally, it must first become imaginable internally. The mind rarely moves toward futures it cannot conceive. If abundance feels impossible, the nervous system treats it as irrelevant. Attention remains focused on familiar limitations. But when possibility expands, attention begins exploring new territory. This expansion creates room for innovation. And innovation is one of the primary drivers of prosperity. Every meaningful advancement begins as an idea. Every business begins as an idea. Every invention begins as an idea. Every solution begins as an idea. The ability to generate and act upon ideas depends heavily on mental and emotional conditions. Creativity flourishes when the brain feels safe enough to explore. It struggles when the brain remains trapped in defense mode. This reveals something profound. Abundance is not merely about resources. It is also about access.
Access to creativity.
Access to insight. Access to resilience. Access to higher quality decision-making. These invisible resources often determine the visible resources that follow. When viewed through this lens, frequency becomes less mysterious and more practical. It reflects the overall quality of our internal environment. Just as fertile soil supports healthy growth, a coherent internal environment supports constructive action. The question then becomes, what kind of environment am I creating within myself each day? Am I reinforcing fear or possibility? Am I strengthening resentment or gratitude? Am I rehearsing failure or preparing for success? Every repeated emotional state contributes to the answer. This does not mean ignoring difficulties. In fact, genuine transformation requires honesty. Pretending challenges do not exist serves no purpose. The goal is not denial. The goal is response. Can I acknowledge a challenge without becoming identified with it? Can I face uncertainty without surrendering my creativity? Can I encounter obstacles without allowing them to define my future? These questions reveal the difference between circumstance and identity. Circumstances change. Identity tends to persist. And because identity persists, it often exerts greater influence than temporary conditions. A person who maintains an empowered identity during difficult times frequently recovers more effectively than someone who adopts an identity of helplessness. The external situation may be identical. The internal interpretation is not. Interpretation influences action. Action influences outcome. The chain continues. Over months and years, these differences become increasingly significant. This is why I believe wealth creation is ultimately connected to self-creation. The process is not simply about accumulating resources. It is about developing qualities that allow resources to be generated, multiplied, and directed wisely. Patience, focus, emotional intelligence, adaptability, vision, integrity. These qualities create stability that extends beyond temporary gains or losses. They form a foundation, and foundations matter because life inevitably contains uncertainty. Markets change, industries change, technologies change, circumstances change. But an individual who has cultivated strong internal foundations carries those capacities into every new situation. They do not depend entirely on external conditions for confidence. They generate confidence from within. This inner stability becomes a form of wealth in itself. Perhaps not the kind measured on financial statements, but the kind that makes every other form of wealth more sustainable. Because without internal stability, external success can become fragile. With internal stability, challenges become easier to navigate. Opportunities become easier to recognize. Growth becomes easier to sustain. And as this understanding deepens, another realization begins emerging. One that connects consciousness, biology, perception, and prosperity into a single framework, suggesting that the most valuable transformation may not be the money we attract at all, but the person we become in the process of learning how to align our thoughts, emotions, and actions with a vision that is larger than our current circumstances, because it is within that alignment that an entirely new relationship with possibility starts to take shape. And once that new relationship with possibility begins to take shape, something subtle yet powerful starts happening beneath the surface of everyday life. The world itself may appear unchanged. The same environment exists. The same people surround us. The same responsibilities remain. Yet our experience of reality begins shifting. This shift occurs because consciousness acts like a lens. The lens determines what comes into focus. Two individuals can stand in the same room and walk away with completely different interpretations of what happened. One notices obstacles. The other notices opportunities. One sees limitation. The other sees potential. The difference is not necessarily intelligence, education, or talent. The difference often lies in what each person has trained themselves to perceive. This is why awareness is such a valuable form of wealth. Without awareness, we unconsciously repeat patterns. With awareness, we gain the ability to observe those patterns before acting on them. That moment of observation changes everything. A fear-based reaction can become a conscious response. An old habit can become a new choice. A limitation that once felt permanent can become something that is questioned. And once a pattern is questioned, it begins losing some of its power. Many people spend years trying to change external results while overlooking the internal programs producing those results. It is similar to repeatedly trimming the branches of a tree while ignoring the roots. The branches continue growing back because the source remains unchanged. Real transformation often requires working at the level of the root. The root is identity. The root is belief. The root is emotional conditioning. The root is the story we tell ourselves about who we are, and what is possible. Stories are remarkably powerful. Human beings naturally organize experience through narrative. We create explanations for our successes. We create explanations for our failures. We create explanations for what we deserve and what we do not. Over time, these explanations become part of our identity. Eventually, we stop seeing them as stories. We begin seeing them as reality. Yet many of these stories were never consciously chosen. Some were inherited from family environments. Some emerged from childhood experiences. Some developed through repeated disappointments. Others formed through social conditioning. The mind absorbs these influences and gradually constructs a model of reality. The challenge is that outdated models can continue guiding behavior long after they stop being useful. A person who experienced financial struggle years ago may still be making decisions from that emotional memory today. The circumstances changed. The emotional program did not. This is where intentional awareness becomes transformative. When I begin observing my patterns honestly, I create space between the observer and the pattern itself. I realize that a belief is something I possess. It is not necessarily who I am. I realize that fear is something I experience. It is not necessarily an accurate prediction of the future. I realize that past experiences shape me, but they do not have to define me. This realization creates freedom. Not instant freedom, but progressive freedom, the freedom to choose a different interpretation, the freedom to practice a different emotional state, the freedom to create a different future. And this is where many people discover an important truth about abundance. Abundance is not only about having more, it is about perceiving more possibilities, more solutions, more connections, more opportunities for growth. When perception expands, options expand. When options expand, action becomes more effective. And effective action creates momentum. Momentum is one of the most underestimated forces in personal transformation. Small actions often seem insignificant when viewed individually. A single conversation appears ordinary. A single decision appears minor. A single new habit appears inconsequential. But momentum transforms small actions into larger outcomes. The effect compounds. One decision leads to another. One opportunity creates access to another. One improvement builds confidence for the next. Over time, results that once seemed impossible begin appearing through the accumulation of many seemingly insignificant choices. This is why consistency often outperforms intensity. Intense effort can produce temporary results. Consistent effort creates lasting change. The nervous system learns through repetition. Identity evolves through repetition. Mastery develops through repetition. Frequency itself is shaped through repetition. Every day we are rehearsing a version of ourselves. The question is whether that version is aligned with the future we desire. If I spend each day rehearsing stress, fear, and limitation, those patterns strengthen. If I spend each day cultivating clarity, gratitude, discipline, and creative thinking, those patterns strengthen instead. The nervous system adapts to whatever it practices most frequently. This principle is neither positive nor negative. It is simply how adaptation works. The remarkable part is that once we understand this process, we can participate in it consciously. We are no longer passive observers of our conditioning. We become active participants in our development. This changes the relationship between consciousness and wealth entirely. Wealth stops being viewed as something external that must be pursued at all costs. Instead, it becomes an expression of internal organization, a reflection of how effectively our thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and actions work together. When alignment increases, efficiency increases. When efficiency increases, results often improve. Not because reality suddenly changes its rules, But because we begin engaging those rules more effectively, the person who operates with clarity tends to make better decisions. The person who manages emotions effectively tends to navigate setbacks more successfully. The person who maintains a long-term perspective tends to recognize opportunities that others overlook. These advantages compound over time. Eventually, what appears to be extraordinary success may simply be the visible result of years spent cultivating invisible capacities. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons hidden within the study of consciousness. The most important transformations often occur long before they become visible. They happen in thought patterns. They happen in emotional habits. They happen in daily choices. They happen in identity shifts that no one else can see. Yet those invisible changes eventually influence everything else. Relationships change, decisions change, behavior changes, results change. Life begins reflecting a different internal blueprint. And when that blueprint becomes increasingly coherent, increasingly intentional, and increasingly aligned with a vision of possibility rather than limitation, a deeper question naturally begins to emerge, a question that invites us to explore whether the true secret of abundance has never been about acquiring something outside ourselves, but rather about awakening capacities that have been present within us all along, waiting for the moment we become conscious enough to recognize and activate them. And once that new relationship with possibility begins to take shape, something subtle yet powerful starts happening beneath the surface of everyday life. The world itself may appear unchanged. The same environment exists. The same people surround us. The same responsibilities remain, yet our experience of reality begins shifting. This shift occurs because consciousness acts like a lens. The lens determines what comes into focus. Two individuals can stand in the same room and walk away with completely different interpretations of what happened. One notices obstacles. The other notices opportunities. One sees limitation. The other sees potential. The difference is not necessarily intelligence, education, or talent. The difference often lies in what each person has trained themselves to perceive. This is why awareness is such a valuable form of wealth. Without awareness, we unconsciously repeat patterns. With awareness, we gain the ability to observe those patterns before acting on them. That moment of observation changes everything. A fear-based reaction can become a conscious response. An old habit can become a new choice. A limitation that once felt permanent can become something that is questioned. And once a pattern is questioned, it begins losing some of its power. Many people spend years trying to change external results while overlooking the internal programs producing those results. It is similar to repeatedly trimming the branches of a tree while ignoring the roots. The branches continue growing back because the source remains unchanged. Real transformation often requires working at the level of the root. The root is identity. The root is belief. The root is emotional conditioning. The root is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what is possible. Stories are remarkably powerful. Human beings naturally organize experience through narrative. We create explanations for our successes. We create explanations for our failures. We create explanations for what we deserve and what we do not. Over time, these explanations become part of our identity. Eventually, we stop seeing them as stories. We begin seeing them as reality. Yet many of these stories were never consciously chosen. Some were inherited from family environments. Some emerged from childhood experiences. Some developed through repeated disappointments. Others formed through social conditioning. The mind absorbs these influences and gradually constructs a model of reality. The challenge is that outdated models can continue guiding behavior long after they stop being useful. A person who experienced financial struggle years ago may still be making decisions from that emotional memory today. The circumstances changed. The emotional program did not. This is where intentional awareness becomes transformative. When I begin observing my patterns honestly, I create space between the observer and the pattern itself. I realize that a belief is something I possess. It is not necessarily who I am. I realize that fear is something I experience. It is not necessarily an accurate prediction of the future. I realize that past experiences shaped me, but they do not have to define me. This realization creates freedom. Not instant freedom, but progressive freedom. The freedom to choose a different interpretation, the freedom to practice a different emotional state, the freedom to create a different future. And this is where many people discover an important truth about abundance. Abundance is not only about having more, it is about perceiving more possibilities, more solutions, more connections, more opportunities for growth. When perception expands, options expand. When options expand, action becomes more effective. An effective action creates momentum. Momentum is one of the most underestimated forces in personal transformation. Small actions often seem insignificant when viewed individually. A single conversation appears ordinary. A single decision appears minor. A single new habit appears inconsequential. But momentum transforms small actions into larger outcomes. The effect compounds. One decision leads to another. One opportunity creates access to another. One improvement builds confidence for the next. Over time, results that once seemed impossible begin appearing through the accumulation of many seemingly insignificant choices. This is why consistency often outperforms intensity. Intense effort can produce temporary results. Consistent effort creates lasting change. The nervous system learns through repetition. Identity evolves through repetition. Mastery develops through repetition. Frequency itself is shaped through repetition. Every day, we are rehearsing a version of ourselves. The question is whether that version is aligned with the future we desire. If I spend each day rehearsing stress, fear, and limitation, those patterns strengthen. If I spend each day cultivating clarity, gratitude, discipline, and creative thinking, those patterns strengthen instead. The nervous system adapts to whatever it practices most frequently. This principle is neither positive nor negative. It is simply how adaptation works. The remarkable part is that once we understand this process, we can participate in it consciously. We are no longer passive observers of our conditioning. We become active participants in our development. This changes the relationship between consciousness and wealth entirely. Wealth stops being viewed as something external that must be pursued at all costs. Instead, it becomes an expression of internal organization, a reflection of how effectively our thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and actions work together. When alignment increases, efficiency increases. When efficiency increases, results often improve. Not because reality suddenly changes its rules, but because we begin engaging those rules more effectively. The person who operates with clarity tends to make better decisions. The person who manages emotions effectively tends to navigate setbacks more successfully. The person who maintains a long-term perspective tends to recognize opportunities that others overlook. These advantages compound over time. Eventually, what appears to be extraordinary success may simply be the visible result of years spent cultivating invisible capacities. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons hidden within the study of consciousness. The most important transformations often occur long before they become visible. They happen in thought patterns. They happen in emotional habits. They happen in daily choices. They happen in identity shifts that no one else can see. Yet those invisible changes eventually influence everything else. Relationships change. Decisions change. Behavior changes. Results change. Life begins reflecting a different internal blueprint. And when that blueprint becomes increasingly coherent, increasingly intentional, and increasingly aligned with a vision of possibility rather than limitation, a deeper question naturally begins to emerge, a question that invites us to explore whether the true secret of abundance has never been about acquiring something outside ourselves, but rather about awakening capacities that have been present within us all along, waiting for the moment we become conscious enough to recognize and activate them. And this realization invites us to look deeper into what it truly means to awaken capacities that have always been present within the human system but often remain dormant due to repetition of limiting patterns and unconscious conditioning, we begin to see that consciousness is not merely a passive observer of reality, but an active participant in how reality is experienced, interpreted, and navigated. This shifts everything about how we understand wealth, growth, and human potential, because now the focus is no longer solely on external acquisition, but on internal architecture, the structure of thought, emotion, and identity that shapes every perception and decision made from moment to moment. When I observe this architecture more closely, I notice that most individuals are not lacking opportunity, but are instead lacking alignment between what they consciously desire and what their subconscious patterns consistently reinforce. This misalignment creates friction within the system of experience, where effort feels heavy, progress feels slow, and outcomes appear inconsistent. Yet beneath this surface struggle, there is always a deeper intelligence at work. The nervous system is constantly adapting, always seeking familiarity and stability, even when that familiarity is rooted in limitation. This is why transformation often begins with discomfort, because the system resists change, not out of opposition, but out of protection. It is attempting to preserve what it has known, even if what it has known is no longer serving growth. As awareness increases, however, something begins to shift. The observer within becomes stronger than the automatic pattern, and with that strength comes the ability to pause, to interrupt reaction, and introduce choice. This pause is where transformation lies, because in the space between stimulus and response, a new possibility emerges, one that was previously inaccessible when behavior was purely automatic in that space. I can ask myself what is actually true here, not what am I afraid of or what have I always assumed, but what is directly observable and what response would align more closely with the future I intend to create. This shift from reaction to observation represents a fundamental evolution in consciousness, because it moves the individual from being driven by internal programming to becoming aware of that programming and eventually capable of reshaping it over time. This reshaping process becomes the foundation of what many describe as personal transformation. Yet it is not a single event, but a continuous unfolding of awareness, action, and integration. Each moment of conscious choice adds to the cumulative direction of life, gradually forming new patterns that replace old ones. And as these new patterns stabilize, the individual begins to experience a different relationship with uncertainty. What once felt threatening begins to feel navigable. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable, and what once felt fixed begins to feel changeable. This shift in perception is one of the clearest indicators that frequency has begun to evolve, not because the external world has immediately transformed, but because the internal interpretation of that world is no longer constrained by previous limitations. Instead, it is informed by expanding awareness and a growing capacity to perceive options that were previously invisible to consciousness. This expanded perception does not guarantee immediate external change, but it creates the necessary conditions for different actions to become possible. And it is through these new actions that new outcomes eventually emerge over time. The relationship between inner state and outer experience becomes increasingly clear, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience. The individual begins to recognize patterns of cause and effect within their own life, noticing how subtle shifts in attention produce noticeable differences in behavior, and how changes in behavior gradually reshape external circumstances. This recognition deepens responsibility, but not in a burdensome way. Instead, it introduces empowerment, because it reveals that influence is not limited to external conditions, but is continuously available through conscious participation in one state of being. At this stage, the concept of abundance becomes less about accumulation and more about resonance, a state in which internal coherence allows external experiences to align more naturally with intention rather than force or struggle. And in this alignment, life begins to feel less like resistance and more like flow, not because challenges disappear, but because the individual becomes more capable of moving through them with clarity, adaptability, and presence. This capacity is often what distinguishes those who appear to create abundance consistently from those who struggle repeatedly. It is not absence of difficulty, but refined relationship with difficulty, where obstacles are interpreted not as final barriers, but as temporary conditions that can be understood, adapted, and eventually transcended. This mindset allows energy to remain directed rather than fragmented, and it is this directed energy that sustains long-term creation in practical terms. This means fewer wasted cycles of doubt and hesitation, and more consistent engagement with meaningful action over time. This consistency becomes the bridge between intention and manifestation, between inner vision and outer reality. And and as this bridge strengthens, life begins to reflect an increasingly coherent expression of the consciousness that is directing it, revealing that what we once called external success may in fact be nothing more than the natural outcome of sustained internal alignment. And this realization opens yet another doorway into understanding how deeply interconnected awareness, choice, and lived experience truly are, suggesting that every moment offers an opportunity to participate more fully in the unfolding of possibility that continues beyond what we currently perceive as the limits of reality, and that understanding itself becomes a gateway into even deeper exploration of what it means to consciously shape the trajectory of human experience in ways that are both practical and profoundly transformative, inviting us to continue questioning how far this capacity truly extends when fully realized within everyday life and human awareness itself. And as this inquiry deepens, it naturally leads us toward an even more fundamental recognition that consciousness and reality may be far more intertwined than previously assumed, opening the possibility that what we call external reality may not be as separate from internal awareness as it first appears, but instead may be continuously shaped, filtered, and interpreted through the living lens of perception that each individual carries within their nervous system and cognitive architecture. And when I begin to sit with this idea more deeply, I notice that it challenges many of the assumptions that people often hold about separation between observer and observed, because if perception is always active rather than passive, then experience itself becomes a dynamic interaction between consciousness and environment rather than a fixed recording of external events. This means that every moment of life is not simply something that happens to us, but something that is co-constructed through attention, interpretation, emotional state, and internal expectation. And when this understanding becomes embodied, rather than merely intellectual, it begins to change how a person moves through the world, because attention itself becomes recognized as a form of creative force, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical neurological sense, where what is repeatedly attended to becomes reinforced in neural networks. And what is reinforced becomes more likely to shape future perception and behavior over time. This creates a feedback loop between experience and interpretation, where each influences the other continuously. And in this loop, identity gradually stabilizes or transforms depending on the patterns that dominate awareness. And it is within this dynamic system that the idea of shifting frequency takes on a more grounded meaning as a shift in dominant patterns of attention, emotion, and behavior, rather than an escape from reality or a denial of practical conditions. Instead, it becomes a reorganization of internal priorities that changes how external conditions are engaged and responded to. And as this reorganization develops, something subtle begins to emerge in lived experience, a growing sense of internal spaciousness, where reactions no longer feel immediate or compulsory, but instead feel observable and modifiable. And within that space, new possibilities begin to surface, not because the external world has changed its structure, but because perception has expanded its range and is now able to detect nuances, opportunities, and relationships that were previously filtered out by habitual focus. And this expanded detection is crucial because it is often not the absence of opportunity that limits human progress, but the inability to recognize opportunity when it appears in unfamiliar forms or disguised within ordinary circumstances. And as awareness refines itself, the individual begins to notice that what once seemed random or disconnected events may actually be part of a larger pattern of guidance formed through the interaction of intention, attention, and responsiveness to feedback from experience itself. And this feedback is not always dramatic. It often arrives subtly through feelings of resonance or resistance, through a sense of ease or friction, through moments where something feels aligned, even if it is not yet fully logical. And it is in these subtle signals that many decisions begin to shift away from purely reactive, survival-based choices toward more intuitive, integrated responses that consider both immediate conditions and long-term trajectory. And as this integration deepens, the individual begins to experience a form of coherence where thought, emotion, and action begin to support rather than contradict each other. And this coherence has measurable effects on behavior, because when internal conflict decreases, energy is no longer consumed by internal resistance and becomes available for constructive action, focus, and creativity, which in turn improves the quality of decisions and the persistence with which those decisions are carried out. And over time, this persistence creates a compounding effect where small, consistent improvements accumulate into significant changes in life structure and opportunity. And from an observational standpoint, this can appear as external transformation, but from an experiential standpoint, it is often recognized as internal reorganization expressing itself outwardly through behavior and circumstance. And this understanding gradually dissolves the perceived boundary between inner development and external success, revealing them as two aspects of a single continuous process rather than separate domains of life. And within this process, the concept of abundance becomes increasingly redefined, not as accumulation of excess, but as alignment with flow, where resources, opportunities, and relationships begin to organize themselves in ways that feel less forced and more naturally occurring as a result of increased clarity and reduced internal fragmentation. And this flow state is not a constant condition, but rather an emergent property of sustained coherence, where the system as a whole is no longer working against itself and instead begins operating as a unified field of intention, perception, and action, and in five. Such a state even challenges begin to take on a different quality, no longer interpreted solely as obstacles, but also as information-carrying structures that reveal where further adjustment, awareness, or refinement may be needed. And this reframing of difficulty plays a significant role in long-term resilience, because it prevents the collapse of identity during periods of uncertainty and instead allows identity to remain flexible, adaptive, and responsive without losing its core direction. And as this flexibility increases, so too does the capacity to engage with complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it, which is an essential skill in environments where change is constant and unpredictable. And in this way, the cultivation of internal stability does not lead to rigidity, but rather to greater adaptability, because stability at the level of awareness allows for greater freedom at the level of action. And as this relationship between stability and flexibility becomes clearer, the individual begins to understand that true strength is not the absence of change, but the ability to remain centered within change and to continue making conscious choices even as external conditions shift rapidly and unpredictably. And this capacity ultimately reshapes the meaning of control itself, moving it away from attempting to force external outcomes and toward developing mastery over internal states that determine how those outcomes are perceived, interpreted, and engaged with. And as this mastery develops further, a deeper inquiry naturally arises into the nature of intention itself and how intention interacts with attention, memory, and expectation to shape the trajectory of lived experience in ways that are still not fully understood, but are increasingly being explored through both scientific observation and experiential reflection. And as this inquiry continues, it opens yet another layer of understanding that suggests intention may function not as a simple directive, but as an organizing principle that influences perception, selection, behavior, and interpretation simultaneously, creating a unified field of focus that guides the system towards certain possibilities while filtering out others. And within this framework, the act of setting intention becomes far more than a motivational exercise. It becomes a form of cognitive and emotional calibration that gradually aligns internal systems toward a coherent direction of movement through life. And as this alignment strengthens the distinction between inner vision and outer reality begins to soften, allowing experience itself to feel increasingly responsive to clarity of direction and depth of engagement. And yet, even as this responsiveness becomes more apparent, it remains grounded in the practical mechanisms of attention, behavior, and adaptation rather than any separation from natural law or observable process. And this grounding is essential because it keeps the exploration anchored in lived human experience, where transformation is measured not by abstract theory, but by observable changes in perception, decision-making, emotional regulation, and the unfolding of real-world outcomes that continue to reflect the evolving relationship between consciousness and the unfolding field of possibility that extends beyond what is currently known. And as this realization continues to deepen, it leads naturally into an even more expansive contemplation of how far this process of conscious participation in reality may extend when fully embodied in daily life, and whether the boundaries we perceive between internal awareness and external existence are ultimately more fluid than fixed. And it is within this question that the exploration continues, moving forward without conclusion into the ongoing unfolding of understanding itself. And as this ongoing unfolding continues to reveal itself within the lived experience of awareness, something even more subtle begins to emerge beneath the surface of thought itself. A recognition that perception is not only shaped by attention, but also by expectation, and that expectation functions almost like a silent architect, continuously designing the contours of what the mind is prepared to recognize and respond to in any given moment. When I examine this closely, I see that expectation is rarely neutral. It carries emotional weight, it carries memory, it carries anticipation of outcome, and this combination creates a kind of internal blueprint that the nervous system uses to interpret incoming experience before conscious reasoning even has a chance to intervene. And because of this, many experiences are not experienced freshly, but are instead filtered through pre-existing frameworks that determine meaning before awareness fully arrives, which explains why two individuals can witness the same opportunity yet respond in entirely different ways. One may perceive uncertainty, while the other perceives potential, even though the external stimulus is identical. And this divergence is not random, it is patterned through repeated cycles of emotional conditioning, memory, reinforcement, and identity formation that gradually solidify into what we might call an expectation field, an invisible but powerful layer of interpretation that surrounds perception and shapes behavior in real time. And as I reflect on this deeper, I begin to see that shifting frequency is not simply about changing thoughts, but about gradually dissolving outdated expectation fields and replacing them with new ones that are more aligned with possibility rather than limitation. This process, however, is rarely immediate because expectation is tied to survival memory, and the nervous system is designed to prioritize familiar patterns over unfamiliar potential, even when those familiar patterns are no longer beneficial, which means that transformation requires patience, repetition, and gentle consistency rather than force or urgency. And this is where many individuals encounter resistance, not because change is impossible, but because the system is attempting to reconcile new signals with old programming. And during this reconciliation phase, internal conflict often intensifies, creating moments where progress feels uncertain, or even reversed. Yet beneath this apparent instability, a deeper restructuring is taking place where neural pathways are reorganizing, emotional responses are recalibrating, and identity is slowly adjusting to accommodate a broader range of possibility. And when this process is supported, rather than resisted, something remarkable begins to happen. Perception itself becomes more fluid, less rigid, and more responsive to present moment information rather than historical conditioning. And in this state, the individual begins to notice subtle openings within experienced moments of insight, intuitive clarity, and unexpected opportunity that previously would have gone unnoticed because attention was anchored too firmly in repetition of the past. And as awareness becomes more flexible, it begins to integrate both internal and external feedback more effectively, allowing decisions to be guided not solely by fear-based prediction, but by a more balanced integration of memory, observation, and present moment awareness. And this integration leads to a gradual reduction in internal contradiction where thoughts, emotions, and actions begin to support one another rather than compete. And as coherence increases, energy that was previously consumed by internal resistance becomes available for creative engagement with life itself. And this creative engagement is where transformation begins to feel tangible because it is expressed not as abstract understanding, but as concrete shifts in behavior, choices, and directionality of focus. And over time, these shifts accumulate, forming new patterns of living that reflect a more unified internal state. And what once required conscious effort begins to occur more naturally as the system becomes accustomed to operating from a place of alignment rather than fragmentation. And within this alignment, perception expands further, allowing the individual to recognize that opportunities are not always large dramatic events, but often exist as subtle invitations embedded within ordinary circumstances, waiting to be noticed by a mind that is no longer constrained by rigid expectation fields. And this recognition fundamentally changes the relationship between effort and outcome, because effort is no longer driven by tension or struggle, but by clarity and direction. And when effort is guided by clarity, it becomes more efficient, requiring less internal conflict and producing more consistent results over time. And this efficiency is often misinterpreted from the outside as ease or luck, yet from within it is experienced as the natural consequence of coherence, where actions arise from alignment rather than fragmentation. And as this coherence stabilizes, a deeper sense of trust begins to develop, not trust in external conditions, but trust in the process of awareness itself. The understanding that perception, when refined, can guide action more effectively than fear-based prediction ever could. And this trust does not eliminate uncertainty, but changes the way uncertainty is experienced, transforming it from something threatening into something navigable, something that can be engaged with curiosity rather than avoidance. And in this shift, the nervous system begins to relax its constant vigilance, allowing for greater openness, creativity, and adaptability, which further reinforces the cycle of alignment. And as the cycle continues to deepen, the distinction between inner development and outer experience becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, because every internal shift is mirrored by external changes in perception behavior. And opportunity structure reinforcing the understanding that what we call reality is not separate from the observer, but continuously shaped through the interaction of awareness, interpretation, and action. And within this understanding, the concept of abundance becomes less about accumulation and more about participation in the dynamic field of possibility where outcomes are not fixed endpoints, but evolving expressions of consciousness interacting with circumstance in real time. And as this perspective continues to expand, it opens further inquiry into how far this participatory relationship extends, and whether there are still deeper layers of interaction between intention, perception, and unfolding experience that have yet to be fully recognized. And it is within this ongoing inquiry that awareness continues moving without final resolution into the next horizon of understanding, where each moment becomes not a conclusion, but an invitation to explore further into the nature of experience itself and the unfolding relationship between what is observed and the consciousness through which it is observed. And as this inquiry continues to deepen beyond familiar boundaries of interpretation, something increasingly clear begins to emerge within awareness itself, a recognition that attention is not only selective, but fundamentally creative in how it structures lived experience moment by moment through the continuous prioritization of certain signals over others. And when I observe this process carefully, I see that what we commonly call reality is always already filtered through layers of selection, interpretation, and emotional weighting long before conscious thought attempts to make sense of it. And this means that the experience of life is never a direct transmission of external events, but rather a constructed field of meaning shaped by both conscious intention and unconscious conditioning, working together in a dynamic and constantly updating system. And within this system, attention functions as the primary organizing principle, because whatever receives sustained focus becomes amplified within perception, while everything else recedes into the background, not because it ceases to exist, but because it is no longer prioritized by the nervous system. And this simple yet profound mechanism reveals why two individuals exposed to the same environment can inhabit entirely different experiential worlds, one characterized by limitation and contraction, and the other by possibility and expansion, even though externally nothing appears to separate them except the orientation of their attention and the emotional charge attached to what they observe. And as this understanding becomes more embodied, it begins to reshape the way intention is understood, not as a distant goal projected into the future, but as a present moment alignment of attention, emotion, and expectation that continuously signals to the nervous system what kind of reality is being reinforced through experience. And this signaling process is not abstract, it is biological, involving shifts in neurotransmitters, hormonal activity, and neural activation patterns that together influence how the body prepares to act, respond, and interpret incoming information. And because of this, the internal state is never separate from external engagement, but is always participating in shaping how external circumstances are navigated and what possibilities are even recognized as viable within those circumstances. And this is where the idea of frequency becomes especially meaningful, because it describes not a static condition, but a dynamic pattern of coherence or incoherence across thought, emotion, and physiological response that determines the quality of interaction between the individual and their environment. And when coherence increases, the system becomes more efficient, requiring less internal effort to maintain clarity, direction, and emotional stability, while simultaneously increasing sensitivity to opportunities that were previously overlooked due to cognitive or emotional noise. And this increased sensitivity is often experienced as intuition, although it is deeply grounded in the brain's ability to integrate subtle patterns of information more effectively when not overwhelmed by stress or internal conflict. And as coherence stabilizes over time, a shift in identity begins to occur, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual reorganization of self-perception, where the individual no longer primarily identifies with past limitations or habitual emotional responses, but instead begins to recognize themselves as an evolving system capable of adaptation, learning, and expansion. And this recognition is critical because identity acts as a stabilizing framework for behavior, meaning that once identity shifts, behavior naturally follows without the same level of resistance that accompanies forced change. And as behavior changes, results begin to reflect new patterns of engagement with life, which in turn reinforce the emerging identity, creating a feedback loop of transformation that strengthens over time. And what is particularly important in this process is that external circumstances do not need to change first for internal transformation to occur. Rather, internal transformation is what gradually reconfigures the interpretation of external circumstances, allowing new responses to emerge within the same environment. And this reverses the common assumption that change must begin outside before it can be felt inside, instead revealing that perception itself is the primary interface through which reality is experienced and modified in lived experience. And when perception shifts even subtly, the range of possible actions expands because the mind is no longer constrained by previously fixed interpretations of what is possible or impossible. And this expansion of perceived possibility is one of the most powerful catalysts for change because it directly influences motivation, creativity, and willingness to engage with uncertainty in new ways. And over time, this willingness becomes a defining characteristic of individuals who appear to navigate complexity with greater ease, not because they avoid difficulty, but because they interpret difficulty through a lens that includes adaptability, learning, and forward movement, rather than finality or limitation. And as this lens stabilizes, the experience of abundance itself begins to change from something pursued externally to something recognized internally as a state of openness, responsiveness, and creative engagement with life. And in this state, effort is no longer driven by pressure or lack, but by alignment with an internal sense of direction that feels increasingly coherent and self-reinforcing. And this coherence is what allows sustained action without burnout, because energy is no longer being lost through internal contradiction, but is instead being directed toward meaningful expression and contribution within the environment. And as this process continues to unfold, attention begins to reveal even deeper layers of interaction between expectation, memory, and perception, suggesting that what we anticipate plays a significant role in shaping what we notice and how we respond even before conscious evaluation occurs. And this anticipatory structure of consciousness means that the future is not simply awaited, but is continuously influencing the present through the lens of expectation that colors perception and guides interpretation in subtle yet powerful ways. And as awareness of this mechanism increases, it becomes possible to consciously participate in the formation of expectation rather than being passively shaped by it. And this participation introduces a new level of responsibility because it implies that the quality of future experience is influenced not only by external action, but also by the internal states we repeatedly inhabit and reinforce through attention and emotional engagement. And as this understanding deepens further, it naturally leads into an even broader contemplation of how consciousness itself may function as an integrative field where intention, perception, memory, and action are not separate processes, but interconnected aspects of a unified system, continuously organizing experience into meaningful patterns that reflect both past conditioning and present awareness. And within this integrated view, the exploration continues without closure into the unfolding relationship between observer and observed, where each moment becomes an opportunity to refine perception, expand awareness, and engage more consciously with the ongoing creation of lived reality itself.
What we've been exploring in this script is not just the idea of attracting money, but something far more fundamental: how human perception, emotion, and biology interact to shape the quality of lived experience. To understand this deeply, I want to slow it down and translate the entire concept into something practical, grounded, and easy to apply in real life. Because if we strip away the complex language, what we are really talking about is this: your inner state influences how you see the world, and how you see the world influences what you consistently do inside it. That chain is where everything begins. Let's start with the science in simple terms. Your brain is not a passive camera recording reality. It is more like a prediction engine. It constantly takes in sensory information, compares it with past experiences, and then decides what it thinks is happening before you are even consciously aware of it. This is why two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different interpretations. One person sees danger, another sees opportunity. The event is the same, but the internal prediction system is different. Now, here's where emotion enters the picture. Emotion is not just a feeling. It is a biological state that changes how your brain processes information. When you are stressed, your attention narrows. Your brain focuses on survival and immediate threats. When you are calm and open, your attention widens. You notice more possibilities, more details, and more subtle opportunities. A simple real-life example. Think about trying to solve a problem when you are anxious versus when you are relaxed. In anxiety, your thinking becomes repetitive and rigid. In calmness, ideas feel more flexible and creative. Nothing external changed, only your internal state shifted. This is the foundation of what people often call frequency. Not something mystical, but your consistent emotional and mental pattern over time. Now let's connect this to money and opportunity. Financial opportunity in real life rarely appears as a giant obvious event. It usually comes in subtle forms: a conversation, a new idea, a skill you could learn, a connection you could make, or a problem you notice that others ignore. But here is the key: you can only act on what you notice. And what you notice is heavily influenced by your internal state. If your mind is conditioned around fear or scarcity, your attention naturally scans for problems, risks, and limitations. You become highly aware of what could go wrong. This is not a flaw, it is a survival mechanism, but it can become limiting when it dominates your entire perception of life. If your mind is conditioned around curiosity and possibility, your attention begins to detect openings. You start seeing solutions where others only see obstacles. So, in practical terms, shifting your frequency means training your attention and emotional state so that you are not locked into a survival only perception of reality. Now, let's make this very practical. There are 3 layers you can work with daily. First is the body. Your nervous system sets the baseline for your mental state. If your body is constantly tense, overstimulated, or exhausted, your mind will naturally lean towards stress-based thinking. This is why simple regulation practices matter more than people realize. Something as basic as slow breathing for a few minutes can shift your physiology from stress mode into balance mode. When the body calms down, the mind becomes more flexible. Second is attention. Your attention is like a spotlight. Whatever you repeatedly focus on becomes mentally louder in your experience. If you constantly focus on what is missing in your life, your brain reinforces a narrative of lack. If you intentionally train yourself to also notice what is working, what is improving, and what possibilities exist, you begin reshaping your mental map of reality. This does not mean ignoring problems. It means widening your field of perception, so problems are not the only thing you see. A simple daily practice is to ask, what is one opportunity I am not noticing right now? This question alone starts retraining your awareness. Third is identity. This is the deepest layer. Identity is the story your mind consistently tells about who you are. It silently guides your decisions without you realizing it. For example, if someone identifies as "I am not good with money," they will unconsciously avoid financial learning, hesitate in opportunities, or self-sabotage progress. Not because they are incapable, but because their behavior is aligned with their identity. Change happens when identity begins to shift. Instead of forcing yourself to act rich or think positive, a more effective approach is to gently update your self-perception through small, consistent actions. For example, I am someone who learns how money works. I am someone who notices opportunities. I am someone who improves my financial decisions daily. These are not affirmations in a superficial sense, they are directional statements that guide behavior over time. Now, here is the deeper insight that ties everything together. Nothing in your outer life changes instantly when you shift internally, but your patterns of perception and behavior begin to change immediately. And those small changes accumulate. One better decision, one new idea, one different response, one conversation you would have previously avoided. Over time, these micro shifts compound into entirely new life outcomes. This is why transformation often feels invisible at first. The roots are changing before the fruit appears. So, if someone wants to shift their frequency to attract money, the real process looks like this. Calm the body so the nervous system is not stuck in constant stress. Widen attention so you can see more possibilities than just problems. Rebuild identity so your daily behavior aligns with growth instead of limitation. Then act consistently from that state. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but consistently. Because consistency is what stabilizes new neural patterns, and stabilized patterns become your new default way of being. And eventually, what once felt like effort begins to feel natural. At that point, you are no longer forcing change. You are expressing a different internal state through your everyday life. And that is where real transformation begins to feel less like something you are trying to achieve and more like something you are finally allowing to unfold through you.